Do you know what I hate? Well, I hate a lot of things, but the way the Japanese count is definitely on that list. I would make an angry face to show how upset I am about this, but this is the best I can draw, and it kinda looks like an Asian stereotype. How fitting. Alright, let's start out with a bit of context. So, there's this entire country out in East Asia known as Japan. If you haven't heard of it before, it's where they shot the entire Attack on Titan series. Before becoming this cultural beacon, however, much of Japanese culture was actually inspired by China, which was A, massive, B, wealthy, and C, very smart. They even invented this sick new idea known as writing, which allowed them to keep records and remember things for a much longer time than normal. Naturally, very early on, the Japanese realized how useful writing could be, and wanted to adapt it to their own language. And I can only assume that immediately thereafter there was a conversation that went something like this. Wow! These characters are great! Sure are! We could use these for our own language. Sure can. But each of these characters already have a sound attached to them. What do we do with them? What? Those sounds are Chinese. We don't need to hold on to them. Look, let's just find our own words, and I know! Why don't we give each character two pronunciations? One from Chinese and the other from Japanese, and make the rules determining for which is which completely arbitrary. No, that sounds like a horrible idea. Please just too late! And so, in a move more reviled than the Cambodian genocide, the Japanese language then adopted kun and onyomi readings of all their characters. Kun coming from the Japanese pronunciation, and on coming from the Chinese pronunciation. And among some of these words are, yes, Japanese numbers. So now we have two sets of numbers for Japanese, one in kun'yomi and the other in onyomi. To give some perspective, it'd be as if in English we had two sets of numbers, one in normal English and the other in French. Except it's really old French and spoken with a really thick American accent. What's more is that these numbers aren't actually kept separate. Just counting from 1 to 10 in Japanese will have you cross over from onyomi to kun'yomi repeatedly. Going back to our French example for some perspective, counting from 1 to 10 in English would then sound like
Un, deux, trois, four, cinq, six, seven, eight, neuf, dix.
Truly, a language of beauty. The rules for deciding what pronunciation should be used are rather arbitrary, but they are, however, consistent. So you can bet on all these characters whenever you're counting from 1 to 10 to be completely consistent. Well, except for these characters, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Point is, these by themselves are not that hard to learn. There is, however, an added complication when we throw in counterwords. I'm talking about counterwords. Counterwords don't exist in English, so hold up a second as I explain. In English, whenever you want to count a certain number of objects, you simply have to say a numeral and then follow it up with a noun, like 2 pencils, 3 dogs, 1 star, and so on. In Japanese, it's a little bit more complicated. You start by putting down the numeral like normal, then you follow up with what is called a counterword, then you finish with the noun. Well, actually, in between the counterword and the noun, you're supposed to put a particle known as no, but that's neither here nor there, so we're going to skip it. Point is, every time you say a numeral, you immediately have to follow it up with a counterword. So, for example, let's take the Japanese word ichi, meaning 1, and follow it up with the Japanese counterword tsu, which is used for general objects. So, ichi, tsu. We put them together, and we get hitotsu. Wait a minute, why is it hitotsu? This is where the bullshit starts. Do you remember those onyomi and kun'yomi readings from earlier? Well, as it turns out, when it comes down to counting, it's completely arbitrary which ones are used. Sometimes the numbers are left unchanged. Sometimes they're all kun'yomi. Sometimes they're kun'yomi and onyomi. Sometimes they're slurred together with the counter. Sometimes the counter itself is changed. And you want to know what makes it even worse? These are almost always written in Chinese characters, which have no phonetic indication. So it's very often that you'll come across two characters like this and understand that it means two people, but you wouldn't know how it's pronounced. Even if you know how the character is supposed to be pronounced, there's still a likelihood that you would get it wrong, because you'll still have to guess whether or not the number is supposed to be pronounced using kun'yomi or onyomi. And even then you'd still get it wrong, because in this case, it's a special case where the counter itself is pronounced differently. No wonder Japan makes so many RPGs, their entire language is basically a dice roll. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to mock Japanese people right there. I was just making my angry face. Please don't demonetize me, YouTube. I really rely on my videos income. So yeah, I would say Japanese is a pretty decent language. I do have some minor problems with it, however. I'm gonna say C tier. Hey, quick side note, in case any of you were wondering whether or not Japanese uses kun or onyomi for 0, the most common way of saying 0 is zero. Yep, apparently ever since World War II, they've been taking a lot of English loanwords, and somehow they're harder to decipher than the Chinese characters.